gonna start in a moment.
Now I close
this one.
Okay. I can close it now?
Yep.
Okay.
You are on.
Let me make them watch. Got it. Okay, so I think it's about time, so let's start. It is my pleasure again to introduce our speaker of today. Well, first of all, welcome to this other talk in the STEM week. And we are very fortunate to have here this afternoon Professor Sanchez-Gonzalez from St. Olaf College in Minnesota. He's going to be delivering us today a very nice talk. I don't know if I can, yeah, I was out of the view. So let me tell you a little bit about the academic career of Rodrigo. Well, first of all, he was born in Toluca in Mexico, where he spent his childhood, but then he moved to Querétaro, and here in Querétaro, he got his bachelor degree in chemistry from the Autonomous University of Querétaro. Later on in 2005, he went to the United States and he was working at Los Alamos National Laboratory as a research intern. That was before joining Texas A&M University in 2007, where he did his studies towards his PhD in physical chemistry, working under the direction of Professor North. And he did his dissertation on advanced laser diagnostics development for the characterization of gaseous high-speed flows. That's actually some of the things that he's going to be telling us about this afternoon. And later on, he moved to the Aldrich National Laboratory in Tennessee, where he took a postdoctoral appointment at the Fuels, Engines, and Emissions Research Center, and in collaboration with the National Aerothermochemistry Laboratory at Texas A&M University, or I don't know if this was a collaboration or not, but he worked also later as a postdoctoral researcher in the National Aerothermochemistry Laboratory at Texas A&M University, where he continued to develop his interest in laser diagnostics to explore complex environments. In the fall of 2015, he joined the chemistry department at St. Olaf College, where he established a very successful laboratory, the Laboratory of Energy and Advanced Diagnostics. And well, he splits his teaching time between physical chemistry and the first year chemistry program. So right now, Professor Sanchez-Gonzalez is an associate professor of chemistry at the Department of Chemistry in St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. So I'm pretty sure that he's going to deliver a really exciting talk today. I have the pleasure of knowing Rodrigo from years and years, and I know his commitment to academics, to research, to science, and how exciting it is to hear one of his talks, because he has really interesting things going on in his research laboratory. But I'm pretty sure that he can tell a lot more interesting things about his research that I can do. So I'm going to ask our speaker to start his talk to you. Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for joining us. And I don't know if I have to allow you to share. No, I think it's ready. So please, all yours.
Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the invitation to your STEM week. This is very exciting. And thank you very much for the nice introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I have done after grad school, and particularly some of the things that we have been developing here since I started my independent academic career almost 7 years ago here in Minnesota. Just a little bit of history, as Professor Lopez was saying. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. He talked a little bit about my trajectory. I was born in Toluca, but grew up mostly in Querétaro, and I went there for college in your neighbor institution, Universidad Autónoma de Querétaro. And then, at that point, I actually never wanted to come to the United States. But long story short, life just brought me here. And even after many years of being here, I also never wanted to stay here, but again, life just made sure I stayed here. So here I am. As Professor Lopez said, we know each other since I think we were both in high school, and I was very, very tempted to put a picture here of us when we were in college. But what stopped me is that I remembered when I was a college student, many people giving these type of talks with pictures of themselves when they were back in college, and I used to think that, number one, they're very old, and number two, that they were a little lame. So I'm not gonna do that to you, and I'm not gonna do it to myself for sure. So there's a little more recent picture of me right here. So I am at St. Olaf College. It is a liberal arts institution. That's about 45 minutes south from Minneapolis in Northfield. That's a town of about 20,000 people. So our institution has about 3,000 students, about 300 faculty. And this is a real picture of how campus looks like this time of year in the winter. We're at about -15 Celsius today, not too cold, not too warm, just a typical winter day in Minnesota. And I am located in this building that you see right here. That's the Regents Hall of Natural Sciences that has all sciences, including chemistry. And for the size of our institution, we actually graduate. We have a fairly robust chemistry program. We graduate somewhere between 40 to 50 chemistry majors every year. We have a 14 full-time faculty. More than half of us are research active in a variety of areas. And I'm located on the 3rd floor, where I have a very nice lab. That's a laboratory of energy and applied diagnostics. And I am a chemist by training. I'm a physical chemist, but you walk into my lab and you're going to think it's a chemistry lab. It looks more like an engineering physics kind of thing. And this is actually big part of what I do. I do not have an identity as a pure chemist, and I'm certainly not a physicist or an engineer. But I have worked on this overlap of all these areas, and I have come to think that sometimes different disciplines are very, very isolated. So sometimes being in the overlap, right, in the connection of these disciplines, it's actually a specialty in its own. So what I do is develop laser-based diagnostic techniques that are applied mainly to high-speed flows. We study some molecular energy transfer phenomena, and anytime that you develop new techniques to measure stuff, you also have to come up with a way of analyzing that data. So we do a lot of work on data analysis and developing algorithms to process some images, as I will tell you today. And being this an undergraduate institution, there is a big emphasis on the educational component of all the research, right? So we want to do good research, but we also want to make sure that it also serves the education of students. So this is the outline of what I'm going to be talking about. So mostly this talk is divided in two main sections. First of all, how do you go about measuring velocities in high-speed flows? And the second one, how do you measure temperatures? And I'll try to convince you a little bit about what's so important about measuring these two variables in high-speed flows, and how a chemist fits into these measurements. A motivation for this is, as Professor Lopez also said at the beginning, is we work mostly with high-speed flows applied to high-speed aerodynamics, right? In a very particular regime, speed regime, that's called the hypersonic regime, that I will define in a second. So I don't want this to be just mostly technical, but also I feel I tell you a little bit about the motivation of this work, right? And how as a chemist we can approach these problems in a way that other people cannot do it, like engineers working, aerospace engineers working in this area cannot approach this in a way that a chemist can, and that's where collaborations become really important to, well, there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration, but also to develop new, interesting, multidisciplinary science. So I like to start with some basic concepts. And you may have heard about this concept called the Mach number, right? So Mach number is a metric that is used to describe the speed of things, mostly moving faster than the speed of sound, right? So basically, Mach number is multiples of the speed of sound, right? Just to say that something is moving twice the speed of sound, 3 times the speed of sound, right? So you say like it is Mach 2, it is Mach 3, it is Mach 4, and things like that, right? So the speed of sound is basically how fast molecules move at a certain temperature, and we're just trying to say if an object is trying to move faster than molecules themselves can move, right? Because once this happens, once something is moving faster than the molecules themselves, we have very interesting phenomena affecting how things behave. Just to give you, put things in perspective of what high speed means, right, in terms of this molecular motion context. The speed of sound is about at room temperature about 350 meters per second, right? So anything moving slower than that, right, is called subsonic. Something moving faster than that, right, so Mach 1 or faster, right, is called supersonic, right? That's, for example, it's like a bullet moves at supersonic speed. Something that moves at least 5 times the speed of sound is called hypersonic, and this is where this interesting stuff happens, right? There's much faster than a speeding bullet. These are just some examples of where these hypersonic applications are important, right? Defense, aerospace, right, and transportation. Transportation, not so much, but there is a lot of research to develop transportation that is hypersonic, right? Like really developing really fast commercial airplanes. Most of you are probably too young to remember this. Probably around the time when you were born, I think it was about around 2003. We had the last flight of the only supersonic commercial airplane that has existed, as the Concorde. If you look it up, one of the many problems of this supersonic commercial transportation airplane was aerodynamic heating that limited how fast it could move. The fastest speed was Mach 2.02, something like that, right? So it's one of the problems was, as I was saying, it just heated up too much and too easily, and it just became so expensive to fly this thing because they had to spend a lot of money on keeping it cool, cooling it down, and that combined with other problems just ended the time of the Concorde. And since then, there hasn't been another commercial airplane that moves at those speeds. So why is it that it was heating up? Right, so and this is just going to show you what happens when things move faster than the speed of sound, or as I was saying, faster than molecules themselves can move. Right, so just imagine that this dot in the middle is one of you just talking. Right, so when you're talking, you are emitting pressure disturbance in air. Right, so that's what sound is, and this is how it looks like. Right, so if you start talking and then start walking at the same time, this is what happens, right? So this is you may be familiar with the Doppler effect, right? So when you hear, for example, an ambulance, right, that's driving in your direction, and then it just passes you and starts moving away from you, you know how that the relative frequency of that sound changes, right? It just sounds different because what's happening is that in that direction that source emitting a sound is moving, it just starts compressing the air in front of it, right? If you're emitting a sound, it just starts compressing those pressure disturbances known as sound. And now just imagine that you start moving even faster. There is going to be a point that if you move really fast, you're going to be moving as fast as the sound itself. And keep going, you can move even faster than the sound itself. And basically, in practice, what that does is that you move so fast that you are not giving enough time to the air in front of you to move out of the way so you can pass. So you end up compressing that air in front of you. So all of the kinetic energy that you have, just by virtue of your own motion, gets transmitted to the air molecules. So you end up heating up that air, right? So if we could see a bullet, this is how it would look like, compressing the air in front of it, right? So this picture of a bullet was taken a special technique called schlieren, right? It's kind of a shotograph where you can see the formation of a shockwave. A shockwave is just that compression of the air in front of a supersonic or a hypersonic object. So what's going to happen is that once you start transmitting all this kinetic energy to the air by virtue of compression, depending on how much energy you are transmitting, you will have all sorts of effect on the air. It's not going to be just heating up. If you have enough energy, you can start exciting molecules to higher energy states. You can start dissociating air molecules. You can start ionizing these molecules, and you will have a mess of a chemical system just because you are moving really fast. So all of these effects are classified in three categories that are called non-equilibrium effects. One of them is mechanical non-equilibrium. You produce shock waves. Thermal non-equilibrium, you start heating up stuff. And chemical non-equilibrium, once you start ionizing things, dissociating things, then you're gonna start all these chemical reactions that will follow. And what happens is once you start producing non-equilibrium effects in air, so now the air is going to behave completely different. Just imagine an airplane. So now an airplane moving really fast will be affected by all of these phenomena, and it will be affected in a way that something moving at lower speeds will not happen, because it's just those non-equilibrium effects are not observed at lower speeds. So what happens when people are developing new airplanes? They do it computational, right? So they know how things behave. They just have a bunch of mathematical terms into basic fluid dynamics equations, right? So they have all this computational software. And the software will be able to tell you, if you develop a new airplane, a specific shape, specific geometry, it will tell you, is it stable? Is it safe? Is it efficient, right? But once you start having non-equilibrium effects, those models, those computational models do not work anymore. So they cannot, that's why developing high-speed things is so difficult, because you cannot extrapolate those models that describe the behavior of things at low speeds to high speeds, just because they do not account for all those non-equilibrium effects. So that's where we come into play. So we have to collaborate with people developing these models and identify very specific terms in these equations that describe the motion of things that we can measure under those conditions. Then we measure those variables, and then they can go in and plug them into those models, so they can refine and improve those models, and they can continue with this the development of these new airplanes and geometries or whatnot. So how do you do measurements? First of all, the two main measurements that need to be plugged into these equations are how fast things move, right? So we need to measure velocities, and we need to have an idea of energy transfer. As I was saying, energy is very important in these cases, so we need to be able to measure temperatures. So that's why I'm talking to you about how to measure velocities and how to measure temperatures in these flows. So how do you do that? Well, you put things into a wind tunnel, basically, right? And you have to be able to measure things like the ones I said, velocities and temperatures. So you need a way of visualizing the flow itself, right? So you're looking at a low-speed wind tunnel, right? So you can use smoke to see how things behave. And I'm going to show you how we do it, so we can get very, very good and precise measurements of velocity and temperature. So velocities in wind tunnels at high speeds have been measured for a long time by engineers using a technique called particle image velocimetry. Basically, imagine something in a wind tunnel, and they just seed or put in a bunch of very small particles like dust. They seed dust in the wind tunnel, basically. And they hit that dust with a laser. And what the dust particles do is they scatter light, and you can take a picture of that light. If shortly after doing that, you hit those dust particles with another laser and take another picture of it, then you will have two pictures of the same dust particles, except that the dust particles will have moved from the first image to the second one. And then they have very sophisticated algorithms that can tell you how far each of those particles moved in space, and they can reconstruct an entire velocity field, right? So this is how one of those particle image velocimetry or PIV pictures look like. Just imagine you need two of these, separated in time, fit it into the software, and the software will give you an entire velocity map. Unfortunately, when we're dealing with high speeds, there are some disadvantages of using this technique. First of all, remember how we have shockwaves. One of the things about shockwaves is that particles are too heavy to track shockwaves. So basically, you need something that can track the strong velocity gradients that exist along shockwaves. And particles basically just fly through the shock, and they do not respond to the change in velocity. And they have other technical limitations that sometimes it is difficult to have good seeding. If you do not have uniform concentration of particles in the entire flow, you cannot get an entire velocity map. Sometimes some of these wind tunnels, some of these facilities are very, very sensitive. So if you blast these facilities, these wind tunnels with dust, you end up essentially sandblasting the tunnel and just pretty much just destroying your facility. So I'm going to talk to you about a technique that can get the same type of measurement without using particles. And this technique is based on planar laser-induced fluorescence, right? So we want to measure things with lasers for a variety of reasons. One of them is because it's a non-intrusive measurement, right? So you do not need to put in a physical instrument into your wind tunnel to measure velocities. So this planar laser-induced fluorescence is a widely used optical diagnostic technique used for flow visualization and quantitative measurements. And it's relatively simple. It requires a laser, right, like the one you see here. It requires some optics to shape that laser into a sheet so you can actually light up an entire plane. It requires a fluorophore. That means a molecule that can fluoresce. All of the measurements that I'll talk to you about today use nitric oxide, NO, seeded into the flow. And once you excite those molecules with air, they're going to fluoresce, and you take a picture of that fluorescence using a camera. This is planar laser-induced fluorescence. So how do you use this technique to measure velocities and temperatures? Well, we needed to test whatever diagnostics we wanted to develop in a flow field that has that is very predictable, right? First, if you want to develop a new technique, you need pretty much to know the answer of what you're going to measure before you measure it, so you can validate it. And we have done a lot of work with this under-expanded jet flow field that it's basically a gas expansion. See on the left, you have gas, like air, right, at high pressure. It goes through a very small pinhole, an aperture, into a low pressure region. And what happens is if it moves from high to low pressure, it expands, right? So this is what you see, the expansion. The flow, the gas accelerates. If you have taken PChem, you know that under certain conditions, when you expand a gas, it cools down. So we have a flow field that generates a very wide variety of velocities and a very wide variety of temperatures, so we can test the measurements that we develop. So if you take a PLIF, planar laser-induced fluorescence image of this flow, it looks like this, right? It's the same structure on the left. right? So here the expansion starts, it expands, it accelerates, then it just reforms a shock. So as I was saying, this is a simple but very good flow field to test techniques to measure velocities and temperature. So I'm going to tell you about how to measure velocities in these high speed flows using a technique called molecular tagging velocimetry. That is essentially doing the same thing that this other engineering technique does, the particle image velocimetry, except without using particles. It uses laser-induced fluorescence. Molecular tagging velocimetry is a technique where molecules, in this case, remember the one I told you about, we use nitric oxide, where this molecule, nitric oxide, is turned into a flow tracer by optical excitation. So that means that you excite it, and then you can follow how it behaves in time. And this is the concept of how you could measure velocity using this technique. Imagine that you have a flow expanding from a wind tunnel, moving from left to right, and it has a tiny amount of nitric oxide. That is the fluorophore molecule that we like. And then if you hit the flow moving from left to right with a laser at a very special frequency that it excites the nitric oxide molecules, once it starts fluorescing, this fluorescence lasts about 1 microsecond, something like that. And then as it fluoresces, it moves, so you have a fluorescing line moving from left to right. So now if within this fluorescence lifetime, you take multiple images of this fluorescence line, then you can track the fluorescence, how fast it is moving, and reconstruct the velocity map. These are some images. I'll show you. This is the same schematic of how this could look like, right? So this image right here in the bottom left, you have a bunch of laser lines sent from top to bottom. That what you see there is a pattern of fluorescence. And then remember how I told you this fluorescence lasts like about 1 microsecond. Is if you let it move and take multiple images, right? So you have one image, another image, then you can write an algorithm that finds how much each of these lines at each point in space moved horizontally, and then you can reconstruct an entire velocity. Right? So this is the concept of molecular tagging velocimetry, and then, as I said, here's the velocity map just based on these two images. So now, if you send laser lines like this one only in one direction, you can only tell how far the flow is moving horizontally. Right? So if we want to get a little fancier than that, right? So imagine that you have your underexpanded jet seated with a little bit of nitric oxide. You send a bunch of laser lines from top to bottom, but you also send another laser from right to left in a way that you write now an intersection pattern of fluorescence. You are going to end up with images that look like this. It looks like a grid. So now if you let this fluorescence move with the flow, it is going to look something like this. Give me 1 second. It looks like this, right? So now you see how each of these intersections of fluorescence moves in time. And again, so now all you have to do is write a computer program that tracks how far each of these intersections is moving. And that's where a lot of the work we have done comes into play. Right? So basically, this is the concept. You write a bunch of fluorescence intersections. You take two different images in time as the flow is moving with that fluorescence, and hopefully you can find how far and in what direction each of these intersections is moving, so you can reconstruct an entire velocity map. So now, this technique works very well for these flows, but unfortunately, it hasn't been used a lot for a variety of reasons. The main reason is that there are not very good algorithms to process this type of images. Remember how I said engineers like to use particles? They have been using that for decades, and they have very sophisticated algorithms, but we do not have those algorithms for molecular tagging velocimetry. And it hasn't been used for for other reasons, but the main reason is that these algorithms do not exist and they are computationally very expensive. So we worked on developing an algorithm that does that. I'll briefly tell you about it. So this is basically the problem. We have two images taken at different points in time, right? So they are the same flow field. The left one is right when the lasers excite the flow, right? So you see straight lines. And then you see after the flow has moved, right? It has distorted. So what's different about from this field, flow field to the other one is that this one has a little bit of turbulence. That's why you see these wiggles and some regions of the grid missing. So I'm not going to get into the mathematical details of the algorithm. I'll tell you in general what it does. This algorithm that we developed has four main steps. The first one, you need some pre-processing of the images that you take. Sometimes the images that you take are not perfect, so they need a little bit of a touch-up, a little bit of correction of the intensities. Then the next step is you need to find the intersections of the fluorescent grid in both images, in the initial and in the time delayed image. And then you need to connect them. So how far each of these intersections moved will give you a velocity vector for that specific point of the image. But then we took this one step further. We saw that doing it this way would only give us velocity information at the intersections of the image, but we wanted to get velocity measurements along the entire grid lines, not just at the intersection. So we found a way of increasing the space resolution so that we had velocity vectors, not just at the intersections, but also along the lines that connect all of those intersections. So briefly describing those steps is the first one, local thresholding. Right, so as I said, these images, when we are working with turbulent flows, are imperfect. You see how at some points here you have fluorescence that does not exactly belong to the grid lines, and sometimes you have information missing. So it just needs a little bit of pre-processing, so you can get rid pretty much of the garbage, whatever does not belong to the grids, and then it also lights up some parts of the grid. So once we do that, we do another step that essentially finds the intersections of the grid, right? Without going into much detail. So this step is called morphological processing. If you have a background in image processing or computer science, maybe you have heard about it. But essentially what it does is, imagine on the left here, it's a cartoon of a grid intersection. Basically what this morphological processing does is that it results in identifying an area where an intersection of two lines crossing exists. And if you do that for the entire image, right? So you go from an image that looks like this to something that looks like this, where now we have identified or we have written an algorithm that identifies where each of these intersections is. And then from here, we go through each of these intersections, and then we do something that's called blob detection, right? So remember at each intersection, we have two laser lines crossing. So we expect that the fluorescence right at the intersections is going to be higher than anywhere or stronger than anywhere else in the image, because now we have more lasers crossing, so that generate more signal. So this blob detection basically zooms into each of these regions and fits in 3 dimensions the entire profile of that intensity pattern. So we can exactly locate where each of those intersections is with sub-pixel accuracy. So what goes from there is that if you do that for the two images, remember we have an initial image, a time-delayed image, we do this location of intersections in both of them. And now we tell the code to find which intersection in one of the images corresponds to the same intersection in the other image, except if it just displaced a little bit. So we use a few other mathematical tricks to do that, right? You basically use a combinatorial approach here just to minimize the overall distance differences between the points in the initial image to the second image. But anyway, so what this does essentially is it just finds how far each of those intersections moved. So you can extract a velocity measurement at each of those intersections. But remember, we wanted to do even more than that, not just the intersections. We wanted to get displacements along the entire grid line. So for example, this is a cartoon zooming in between two intersections, between this one and this one, right? So what we do is just take that grid line in between intersections and then basically zoom in and fit a polynomial in between the two intersections. So we do that for the initial image along the entire grid lines connecting each pair of intersections, right? So for example, these are is the line, the fit between these two intersections in the initial image. We do the same for the time delayed image, and we can draw velocity vectors from the entire grid lines, grid line patterns in the initial image to the second. So again, this is just to increase the resolution. So how would this look like, right? So if you have these two images, for example, of the two fluorescence grids, initial and time delayed, if you have a measurement just at the intersection points, you end up with a velocity map that looks like this. If you do the fitting in between intersections, you significantly increase the resolution, and now you have velocity measurements along the entire grid, right? So you can increase the resolution, space resolution, actually a lot by doing this. And then that's basically the algorithm. That's fairly automated. It's not computationally very expensive, and it just handles even low quality images fairly well. And those low quality images that are usually obtained in very, very turbulent flows, right? So we did a bunch of tests of the algorithm. And again, we simulated images, and we started, right? So we started with the known answer, right? So remember, we have to start with something that we know how it looks like. So we validate what we're doing, right? So this is the streamwise velocity map, the radial, that means the horizontal and the vertical components of velocity, the vorticity, that's the rotation, local rotation of the flow. So this is how it should look like. And once we applied our algorithm, we were actually very, very happy with what we were obtaining. So we were actually resolving all of these relevant structures in this flow, and we also looked at the difference between, getting just information at the intersections versus what I'm about to show you, getting measurements along the entire grid line, right? So these are the maps of how an interpolated velocity measurement would look like just from measurements and intersections. If we do it along the entire grid lines, you see how the maps on the left look like more pixelated, just because you have way less resolution, as opposed to having a less pixelated velocity map that is just indicating that in fact we have much higher resolution by fitting the lines. And once we validated these with synthetic images, we took actually some real images of turbulent flows. These are real fluorescence images, and we're able to obtain the velocity maps that we were expecting. So this is how a chemist measures velocities using fluorescence in high-speed flows. The other technique that I'm gonna tell you about is how to measure temperatures. And this technique, called the TwoLine Thermometry technique, it also uses planar laser-induced fluorescence. So if you have taken PChem also, or you are familiar with the Boltzmann distribution of energies, so you know that energies are quantized, right? So that molecules exist in different energy levels, and how many molecules are in each energy level is a function of temperature, right? So basically what you see plotted here in red on the right is a Boltzmann distribution of rotational energies for something at 300 Kelvin. And in blue, you see how the same distribution looks like, but now at 50 Kelvin, right? So you see how the population of low energy levels that are plotted on the x-axis is much higher at low temperatures, and then if you increase temperatures, you shift those populations to high energy levels. So the two-line thermometry technique involves measuring the populations of any two energy levels. And if you have heard about the Boltzmann distribution, if you know the population of any two levels, you can work out temperature, right? Temperature will define that ratio of population. So basically, you are measuring how many slowly rotating molecules, right? So if we're talking about rotational energies, how many slowly rotating molecules you have versus, molecules rotating fast. If the nice thing about using lasers to do this is that you can tune a laser to excite only molecules that exist in one specific rotational state. So if you tune lasers to excite low rotational states, and then look at the fluorescence, and then tune the laser to look at high rotational states and look at the fluorescence, they are going to look different. So remember what happens in this expansion. As the gas expands, it cools down. So right here in the center, we have very low temperatures. So remember, the Boltzmann distribution tells you that at low temperatures, you have a lot of molecules in low rotational states. That's why you see significant fluorescence over here. So now, if in that same cold region, low temperature region of the flow, now you excite a high rotational energy level. At low temperatures, there are not lots of those, right? So that's why you're not going to generate a lot of fluorescence. So that's why these two look very different. So if you take a ratio of the populations of those two levels, you get temperature. You can do the same in an image. You take a ratio of those two images, looking at two different rotational states, and you can work out an entire temperature map. So now, if you're dealing with high-speed flows, there is a big disadvantage of using this technique. I'm going to show you why. So this is a schematic of how this experiment looks in time. So at the top, you see when you see the two laser pulses, the one where you excite one rotational state, and then when you excite the other rotational state. So when you excite one rotational state, now we go here to the middle. This is the fluorescence. The fluorescence has a certain lifetime. But now see how you have to wait for that first fluorescence to disappear so you can excite the other energy level and look at the fluorescence. If you don't do that, if you don't wait, then when you take images of each of these two fluorescence events, you won't be able to tell which fluorescence comes from exciting the low energy level versus how much fluorescence comes from exciting the high energy level. So you need to wait at least 1 microsecond. So the first fluorescence goes away, and now you can excite the other rotational state, and then you get the other fluorescence, right? So ideally, you want to get these two images, right? Remember, we need two images to work out temperature. One, a low rotational state, and a high rotational state. So the disadvantage is if you are working with a very turbulent flow that moves really fast, if you take these two images with that much time separation, in between the images, the flow will have moved a lot. So you are going to essentially be looking at two completely different things. So it will be very difficult to tell what the actual temperature is because things moved from one image to the other. So ideally, what you want to do is take these two images at the same time. But remember, you have to be able to tell how much fluorescence comes from one excitation event of one rotational state versus how much fluorescence comes from exciting the other rotational state. So this is how we solve the problem. We use two lasers simultaneously at the same time without any time separation. One of them tuned to excite a low rotational energy level, another a high rotational energy level. But one of them, we made the laser go through a grid. So it generated an image like this one that looks on the left, right? So if the laser goes through a grid, remember, we're using laser sheets. Basically, it's like a mesh. You make it go through a mesh and it generates a bunch of shadows. So this is called modulating a signal. So you are modulating this signal in space, but see how the underlying structure of the flow field is still there. It still has, if you're looking at the low energy level in the cold part of the flow, it still looks very bright. It just has that modulation. The other laser is looking at high energy level, right? So it looks like it should low signal. at for those high energy levels at low temperature. And remember, we're taking these two at the same time. So our image, when we take the picture of these two signals, look like this, the one on the right. So now the problem is here, remember, we have to be able to tell how much fluorescence from this image belongs to this energy level, how much of all of this fluorescence belongs to this energy level. And we used to separate or deconvolve these two signals, we used frequency analysis that basically involves, right? So this is an image of some flow that has, instead of having lines written vertically, a grid written vertically, it's written horizontally. So if you zoom in, you can probably see there the modulation pattern, right? So now if you take this image that's in, let's call it in space domain, right? Take a Fourier transform. Basically, a Fourier transform, what it does, it takes a signal that's either in space domain or in time domain and converts it to frequency domain, right? So basically, you have different structures here in the flow, some of them low frequency, some of them high frequency. And what it does, see, you have a signal at low frequency here in the center in the Fourier transform, and then you have a more other signal at high frequencies. So basically, you are separating what is modulated from what is not modulated, right? And then you can use tricks in the Fourier in the frequency domain to delete one of these two signals, and then after you delete it, you take an inverse Fourier transform to go back, and basically you end up only with either what's modulated or what's unmodulated, depending on what you eliminated in the frequency domain. So this is something that's used a lot in one-dimensional signals in time domain, right? For example, if you're doing a processing of very complex sound signals, right? So you can take a Fourier transform and it just tells you the different frequencies that compose that sound. And then you can, in frequency domain, get rid of the frequencies that you don't like, take the inverse Fourier transform, and then you have a much cleaner sound just at the frequencies that you want. It's exactly the same thing we're doing here, except we're doing it with images. You can get what's modulated versus what's unmodulated just by picking what frequencies you want. And since we write the grid at a frequency that we know, then we know how to pick these frequencies. So we went to test this again in the underexpanded jet flow field, right? So this is how the setup looked like. This is a vacuum chamber where we generate the underexpanded jet flow field. We have a laser that goes top to bottom, that goes through a grid. That's the one that excites one of the rotational states with that modulation. We have the other laser that does not go through the grid, that generates the unmodulated fluorescent signal. We take a picture with a special camera, and then we obtain an image that looks like that, right? So that has both modulated low rotational state signal and the modulated one. So if we do that processing, frequency processing, we were able to separate those two images. See, one of them has that high signal in the low temperatures that we wanted. The other one has a low signal at those low temperatures. Take the ratio, Boltzmann distribution, and we are able to recover the entire temperature map, right? So just to give you an idea of how well this works compared to taking these two images in the traditional way, like completely separated in time. So we are essentially getting the same answer, but now with a much, much higher time resolution. So this is some other work that we have done, and as you have seen, we do a lot of the laser work, but we have to do for both velocity and temperature. We have to do a lot of algorithm development to be able to analyze this complex data. So we spent about half of the time doing experiments, about half of the time just developing these algorithms. So these velocities and temperatures, and just briefly to conclude this. So we're a lab that develops laser-based diagnostic techniques. We do a lot of data analysis, image processing, and we try to, at the same time that we are trying to do good science, we also try to make sure that The students are the ones doing all of this work that they're getting good training, significant training, to move on to what's next in their careers. Anyway, so that's what I have, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, so thank you. Can you hear us, Rodrigo?
Yes.
Professor? Okay, so thank you very much for this very nice talk. Well, we have time for some questions. Actually, I think like the very nice take-home message for everyone is like the various uses that can be given to techniques that we may think at the beginning that are just of the domain of chemistry, probably like these laser diagnostics, but they can be used to determine like temperatures and to determine velocities. So it's really interesting how these techniques interplay between engineering, chemistry, and many other areas. So the floor is open for questions. I would like first students to ask questions. Yes, please. If you can talk to this so that you can hear me.
Yeah, I don't need to press anything.
No.
I just have a question related to the speed of the spaceships and all those type of machines. What happens inside of the cabin? Like they seal the cabin in any way that people can hear the microphone or something like that, because if they're speeding like faster as the speed of the sound, then how they hear the instructions of the microphone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think I just captured the last part of the question.
So what happened inside of the machines? Well, not the machines, the spaceships and all the type of machines, when they exceed the velocity of the sound, do they seal the cabin in any way so the outside doesn't affect the inside and they can hear like well what the people are telling inside, like?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So you mean about the noise generated by the shock waves? That is a very good question. I really don't know the answer, but it comes to two things. So they are insulated in two ways. Number one, it has to be incredibly well thermally insulated, right? Because as I was saying, heating is really a significant effect. So if something is very well insulated thermally, it is very likely that just as a consequence, it's going to be insulated acoustically too. So now when it comes to noise, it's all about relative motion. That it's actually more the sound, the noise is more of a problem for whoever is outside than whoever is inside, because these shock waves propagate around and outside of these vehicles. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So more questions. There's a question, I guess, from someone that is listening via Zoom. So if you want, you can open your microphone.
Yes.
So,
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So in the introduction, you mentioned that the last commercial passenger supersonic flight was in 2003. So my question is, why did they stop doing these type of flights?
Yeah, so a variety of reasons, right? So one of them, the Concorde had been flying for several decades already. So one thing, it was just aging of these airplanes, right? So they completed their lifetimes, but then the problem is that they did not continue developing them. And as I was saying, one of the problems was heating, aerodynamic heating, and the amount of energy. And just think, for example, about a car, right? So if you think about a car just heats up a lot, right? And about 1/3, about 30% of the energy from a car is spent into cooling systems. right? So it's also a problem of how much of the, I mean, yes, it's moving fast, yes, it is doing whatever you want it to do, but is it feasible economically to keep running this thing? And for the case of these airplanes, it was just so expensive to keep them cool that is, you know, if you don't have people paying for these flights, then at some point it's just, there's not going to be any revenue, right? So that was one of the problems. The other main problem is that this airplane could only take off and land in certain airports because once they become supersonic, right? Once they hit the speed of sound, they generate these shock waves. So these shock waves are a huge annoyance to the people living close to the airports, because it just generates this, it's called a sonic boom. That's actually a boom that's scary, that's annoying, and people did not want these airplanes anymore. So the new designs are aimed to, you know, and they are in development, they are aimed at fixing these two problems. One of them is, how can you make it viable economically? And number two, how can you design the geometries in such a way that minimizes the effect of these sonic booms?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have time for more questions, couple more questions from students. No? Okay, so I have one question, actually. So as far as I understand, the measurements, and I'm going to step here so you can see also someone talking to you. So as far as you mentioned, these airflows were measured. I don't know if this is correct or if I misunderstood, but these airflows are measured with NO or NO2, I guess, if I remember correctly, in NO or NO2. So this is not measured like in actual air, like I don't know, like the air that you are going to find like in the atmosphere or somewhere else. So how does this, if that's the case, that this is measured using NO as a gas, how is this going to be related like with real air? Let's say the air that is going to be found in I don't know, like the upper atmosphere or something like that. How is this going to be related? Is there going to be like a big change due to the type of gas that that is being done? And I have another question also that I want to relate to things that our general chemistry students are familiar with, our PChem students are familiar with. Are there any models? I don't know how complicated, and I guess it's very complex because these flows, I guess, have like some randomness. But are there any models that can be used to predict the airflow dynamics or the temperature, like based on simple models like the ideal gas model or some other like Van der Waals gases or things like that, that can be used to predict these types of airflows dynamics?
Yeah. So the first question is actually, yeah, it's actually a very relevant question because yeah, so when you're doing these experiments, you want to make sure that you know, that your measurements are relevant, basically, right? That is air going to behave the same way as whatever you are looking at? And there are two things that happen here. So when these experiments are done, the amount of nitric oxide that's seeded into these flows is very small, right? So let's say like 1% nitric oxide, the rest of air is air. So the flow is behaving, so you're just looking at the NO that's mixed in the air, but essentially the whole thing is behaving the way air behaves, right? And another thing that's important, or that's actually an advantage of using nitric oxide for these experiments, is if you look at the thermal properties of nitric oxide, right? It's somewhere in between nitrogen, N2, and oxygen, O2. It has essentially the same average mass of air, right? Average nitric oxide. It has the same heat capacity as nitrogen and oxygen. So it actually, NO, even if we used more NO than just 1%, it would actually behave pretty much the same as air. So that's about how it would affect using nitric oxide. So it really doesn't. So the next question is predicting the behavior of these flows is actually very difficult once it's relatively easy if you know the composition of your flow, right? But once you start having these non-equilibrium effects, we're going to have, as I said, all these dissociations or these excitations, all these ionizations, all these effects that you would normally not have in let's say, an equilibrium gas mixture. And once all these, you put all of this energy into these molecules, all this energy needs to cascade or transfer into something else. So it turns out that also many of these energy transfer rates, like for example, once you put in this energy into a certain vibrational mode, then from there it needs to be transferred into some other type of mode, and it just becomes a mess. So even some of these energy transfer rates are not known, and that's also why we do some energy transfer studies. That the goal is just even know how fast this energy cascades from one type of energy to other type of energy. So yeah, it is a nasty problem.
Thank you very much, Professor Sanchez. I don't know if there are any other questions. No? Okay. So once again, thank you very much for joining us in our STEM week. We really appreciate it, and thanks for delivering this nice talk. I think we should thank our speaker with a round of applause. Oh, thanks, Professor Sanchez. Well,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, see you.